Good afternoon. This is 2 p.m. Let's start. I'm Yamin Zheng, a PhD student in teaching and curriculum at Warner School of Education. And I'm also a trainee in the PhD training program on augmented and virtual reality at the University of Rochester. Thank you all for joining us for Voices of SR, a Mary Ann McRavenik Studio X speaker series. This series is made possible by Kathy McMurray Marie and the National Science Foundation as part of the interdisciplinary graduate training in science, technology, and applications of augmented and virtual reality at University of Rochester. Today, we are honored to have the speaker, Robb Lindgren. Dr. Robb Lindgren is a professor of educational psychology and curriculum and instruction at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. He has affiliated appointments at the Beckman Institute for Advanced Science and Technology, the National Center for Supercomputing Applications, the Informatica program in the School of Information Systems, the Center for Immersive Computing. Robb currently directs a cross-campus research initiative focused on technology-enhanced learning. Robb has been PI of several NSF-funded research projects examining how people learn in technology-enhanced environments. He and his lab has created prototypes for several STEM learning games and simulations. And they are currently working with local schools and museums to co-design and iterate on several novel SR platforms. Robb's research examines the theories and designs for learning within emerging media platforms, including SR. We are excited to his talk today. Please feel free to post your questions in the chat, and we will have a quick Q&A in the end. This session is being recorded and will be available to you later on the Studio X website. Now I'll turn it over to Dr. Lindgren to begin the presentation.
Thank you so much, Yamin. I really appreciate that very kind introduction. Let's get started with just a few things to say at the outset. So first of all, you can see I'm in kind of a fancy studio right now. This is the teaching lab here at our College of Education at the University of Illinois. I am really thankful for this invitation. I've been looking through some of the other people who have spoken as part of this talk. Lots of really, I think, interesting perspectives on XR technologies, and I'm really excited to be added to that. I want to thank Zenbai in computer science, who was the person who sort of connected me to this speaker series. I'm assuming she's there somewhere in the studio. So I'm going to be talking about designing for learning and assessment in XR. I know you've had a lot of people talking about XR for a lot of different uses and the design of XR. I'm going to be really focused on the ways that we can use this wonderful sort of set of technologies specifically for education. So as I said, I'm at the University of Illinois. This is our College of Education here. We pride ourselves on being a college of education that thinks very forward-thinkingly in terms of our use of technologies. And so we've got a lot of different faculty members and a lot of different labs that are thinking about ways to use technologies in innovative ways to enhance the learning process. This is actually a shot from a lab that we have here in the College of Education that's actually meant to design and collect data about people learning in these kinds of spaces. And so you can see there's some cameras up there at the top of the ceiling that we can use to capture people in more traditional classroom kinds of configurations, or using augmented reality kinds of things where they're moving around the room. I run a lab here called the Embodied and Immersive Technologies group. This is a lab where we focus in on all the ways that particularly immersive technologies like XR can be used for the purposes of learning and education. Got a number of graduate students, some of them doing things related to XR technologies, to virtual reality. A student just defended his dissertation looking at sort of innovative ways of using sort of dot cam kinds of technologies with sort of overlaid embodiment on it in order to have embodied learning interactions across distances and kind of a makerspace kind of environment. So lots of really interesting things related to XR technologies happening within the lab. Yamin mentioned the cross-campus initiative that I run. This is Technology Innovations for Educational Research and Design, which is Tier Ed, and this is getting multiple perspectives from people from other places across campus to get involved in these kinds of things. Because it turns out, across campus, people were already looking at innovative ways that technologies could be used to support education. And so we tried to create sort of a center point within the College of Education for having those conversations, sharing designs, and running collaborative projects together. And then the last plug that I'll give is that I'm part of a relatively recently created center out of computer science here, the Siebel Center for Computing, or Siebel School of Computing, which is Immerse. It's the Center for Immersive Computing, and I am running one of the area leads, focusing in on sort of the contextual factors for the human experience design of immersive computing technologies. And so, please check out all these different labs and initiatives happening at the University of Illinois related to XR. Okay, now we'll get into sort of the bulk of the talk here, focusing in on education. Here's a quick little overview of what I plan to talk about. I want to talk generally about, sort of applications of XR for education, for learning, and some of the learning theories that support it. I want to kind of focus in on, there's lots I could have chosen from, but I sort of focused in on 3 examples of XR technologies used in the educational space. And then I'll talk a little bit about a framework that I've developed with a colleague of mine to try to hopefully develop new designs that allow for embodied interactions with technologies in these XR spaces. And then we'll do some questions after that. So, even though this is obviously an audience is very familiar with XR, I do like to start off by defining it to, just to create a sort of a common shared space. So, I at least think of, and I agree with this definition, extended reality is sort of all the virtual environments, combined together, where the interaction between human and machine occurs through interactions generated by computer technology and hardware. Technologies consist of virtual reality, mixed reality, augmented reality. What I really care about this definition is particularly the focus on interactions and the ways that these kinds of technologies can facilitate new kinds of interactions because of what they are. And then, I've got the sort of the classic continuum here that I'm sure you are all familiar with, sort of looking at the space between, real world reality and virtual reality, and how mixed reality kind of sits in between it. I think and then this is just looking at some of what those applications are at all these different levels of the continuum. I'm not going to sort of define what each of these levels or points are. It's really just to emphasize that there's in that sort of space, everything sort of from pure reality, not including just sort of real world reality, but everything that uses technologies in innovative ways to enhance it. Sort of going to the right there is this XR space, and that's inclusive of lots of different ways of interacting. Right, you can be in completely digitally immersive environments and just have maybe a hand representation or not even a hand, just pointer representations of the real world interacting with it. Or you can have very real world kinds of environments where they just have small or strategic uses of digital representations embedded within them. And the difference there affords lots of different ways that people can interact in various ways of being physical physical and expressive and, moving around in small spaces, like doing gestures right in front of you, or moving around in very large spaces. And that's a whole continuum, a whole space that I think we need to be thinking about its potential application of in education. So why specifically XR in education? I believe it's because they afford opportunities specifically to create designed interactions that remain grounded in reality, but they extend or they augment reality in ways that have the potential to be good for learning. And so my lab has really sort of focused in on, that idea of designed interaction. So we want to create experiences that are specifically designed to support learning based on what we know about learning. Now, a quick caveat, though, with that is that I think sometimes because of all the excitement, because of all the new things that are happening in terms of XR development and design, there's this assumption that because it is so new and because it's so exciting and because it shows us things that we potentially couldn't show before, that it's just always going to be a positive thing and a positive force for education. And you hear a lot about this kind of implicitly, I think, in terms of, oh, but it's so exciting, it's so novel for students. And I agree with all that. I think it is true that these create novel experiences, but we shouldn't necessarily and I say probably not here. We shouldn't necessarily assume that these kinds of this large category of XR experience is always going to be supportive of learning. And just a couple of quick kind of examples of this that I like to pick on a little bit. I mean, there's a lot of these games, particularly when the Kinect was around, that was sort of adding body movement to digital game experiences, and that includes educational games. So a lot of people were creating what they were calling educational games that created situations like the one you see here, where you've got arithmetic problems being presented to students, but instead of answering those questions, using a mouse, these students are answering it by kicking a soccer ball with their feet to the answer. Now, I think we can probably all agree that that there's probably not a huge difference in terms of learning whether or not you answer a question with your hands or whether you answer with a mouse button or whether you answer them with your feet. So I'm not sure that kind of experience is actually adding to the learning benefits of these experiences. Likewise, you still got a lot of people using these what are really designed for single user kinds of experiences and using them in very multi-user kinds of places, right? Like classrooms. And so this idea that you'd have like one person, like you can see here, using a VR headset and having everybody else in the classroom sort of sitting around and watching them, even if they can sort of see what that person is seeing in VR, they're not getting the same experience by being in that space. And then the third example there are these kind of like pop-up AR kinds of things where they take something that's like on a book or on sort of a two-dimensional surface and turning it into 3D. And I love the idea of turning things into 3D, but you have to be thinking about, well, what are the specific affordances of making something 3D? Is it something that you want the student or the learner to understand the 3D structure of that thing? Like maybe you're doing something in chemistry and that's an important thing to do. But even then, you need to be thinking about, well, what sort of additional affordances am I adding to it by making it sort of a pop-up 3D kinds of experiences? So we shouldn't, basically the headline here is that we shouldn't assume that it is that these kinds of experiences are going to be good for learning. They need to be designed to be that way. Some of the questions that I think we need to be asking are, what does the XR technology offer that goes beyond what can be done in the real world? You're still seeing a lot of these kinds of experiences that are basically just replicating things you can do in the real world, and you're sort of left asking, well, why did we need XR for this? So you have to be, and that isn't to say that there aren't often good answers to that questions, but sometimes we don't ask that question enough to make sure that there are, in fact, additional benefits of using XR. how are the interactions afforded by the XR aligned or congruent with the learning goals? So particularly with the arithmetic, and soccer example there, like it's great to get people moving and doing things in physical ways, the ways that you can with XR technologies, but why that specific movement? How does the movement that you have asked the learner to engage in aligned with, in a meaningful way, the learning that you want them to achieve? And then third, does the XR permit authentic social interaction, or does it actually just lock students, individual students, into their own learning environment? And there might be times where it is fine for an individual student to be doing something by themselves independently, but more and more, we're moving towards more socially interactive forms of learning and education, and so we want to make sure that the technologies that we're developing are able to accommodate those kinds of interactions. So then the question is, well, okay, Rob, you've laid out a pretty difficult design problem for all of us. How do we actually now approach, designing effective XR tools for learning and education? And I hear sometimes people say like, oh, I wonder when like some new platform is going to come out that's going to be, XR specifically for education. When is the the metaverse going to, the educational metaverse going to arrive so that we can just sort of, move everything into the XR space? And the truth is, I don't think that that's ever going to come like ready to go and ready to be able to be used for that purpose. The designers of, whether it's a science education experience, whether it's a workplace training kinds of experience, what you design needs to be understanding of and responsive to the specific learning goals of that environment. And so there won't probably be a plug and play kind of platform where you can just take your educational content and put it into VR. You need to be thinking thoughtfully about what the kinds of interactions are that specifically facilitate learning in your context. But there are, thankfully, some tools that you can use that are more general and can speak across these content domains. And those tools are the tried and true learning theories and design principles for interactivity that have been around for quite a long time. Some of them are newer than others, but for the most part, they tend to predate these specific XR technologies that we have available to us now. And the approach that I really encourage is, when you have an idea for how to use these kinds of technologies for learning, you go through a thoughtful, what's often referred to sort of the design-based research process, where you create a iteration of some technology that because of your research and previous data that you've collected and analyzed, you believe has potential for learning, and then you test it and you iterate it and you keep sort of moving it forward in terms of its design, which especially in this sort of fast moving high tech space is often really difficult to do. And that's where I think you particularly need people working in research and scholarly contexts like ours to be doing that kind of work. So what are some of the learning theories that we can utilize here in this space? I'll just cover a couple. Many of these, some of you might be familiar with some of these, maybe all of them, maybe none of them. That's fine. This is just to give you sort of a sense of what are the kinds of ideas that people are using specifically when they're thinking about the design of XR experiences and justifying the design of the XR experiences. It's not likely that anybody's going to give you a whole sack of cash to develop some high fidelity XR experience without a clear rationale for why you think it is going to help students learn. And to my point earlier, why it's going to help them learn more than just giving them an experience in the real real physical world. So one of these things is experiential learning theory. It's an idea that's been around for quite a long time. The process whereby knowledge is created through the transformation of experience. Knowledge results from the combination of grasping and transforming experience. And particularly for XR design, we know that these kinds of technologies do a really good job at giving experiences, often very authentic experiences that frankly they might not necessarily have access to because they're too dangerous, they're too expensive, and XR gives us the opportunity to disseminate those experiences to a wider group of people, but importantly, it can do more than just replicate those experiences, even if they are dangerous and expensive. They can also add augmentation to those experiences as well, and we'll talk more about that in a bit. Another one that gets used quite a bit is situated and distributed learning. The idea that cognition is context dependent and distributed across objects, environments, and people. XR itself is a very distributed technology, right? It's often utilizing larger spaces, sometimes even physical objects within your environment. They are often immersive in a way that more screen-based technologies are not. And so you can create these more situated and distributed kinds of experiences for students. This picture here is actually from a lab here at the University of Illinois that does these virtual archaeology experiences where users can use the VR environment in a simulated archaeological site, the kind of site that is, often in places like Malaysia, places that are not easily accessible to people here in the U.S. And you can see this person is like literally getting down into the ground and doing an excavation using these VR tools. So you can simulate these kind of situated experiences in XR, creating realistic kinds of experiences where they can hopefully be able to then transfer their knowledge to the real world when it comes time to apply them. And then a third is, and the one that I'll probably be focusing most on, in the remainder of the talk, is embodied learning. And this is the space that I work in the most in terms of my theorizing, because I care a lot about the ways that our physical interactions with the environment, the gestures that we make, the objects that we are able to manipulate, how it is that they impact our ability to learn. And oftentimes, the extent to which the actions themselves entail learning, that becoming better at particular kinds of movements or being more comfortable with how you position your body within space is in itself a reflection of learning. And this is, relevant in the space of XR design, because in XR, you can create these embodied experiences, and you can, put people in these, new perspectives where they have to sort of use their body to interact, sometimes with digital, sometimes with physical objects. And they can practice, and they can demonstrate, and maybe most importantly, they can have analyzed the specific movements that they would want to perfect and perform in these kinds of environments. So the field of data analytics or learning analytics, as it's often referred to, is becoming very big and using a lot of these XR spaces, because you can get so much fine-grained data about how people are moving with in relation to these digital objects, artifacts, activities that we're presenting them, and we can sort of understand, well, are they moving in new ways? Are they adapting their movements? And so you can make a lot of interesting inferences about people's learning from the way that they interact in XR environments. ways that you can't really do that in sort of real world classroom kinds of contexts. Another quick plug is that if you're interested in learning more or reading more about the ways that theory get applied to these kinds of spaces, I had a recent paper come out that was led by two of my doctoral students, Taeyun Kim and James Planey, that kind of does this, specifically in this educational metaverse kind of space. This was for a special issue in IEEE transactions on learning technologies, and so this does a pretty deep dive on the different learning theories that go into the design of these spaces. As I said, I'm going to focus mostly on the embodiment component of this and the ways that XR can support embodiment. And there are kind of three specific affordances that I think that that the XR provides for embodied learning that kind of run through the different examples that I'm going to be talking about. So, one is making metaphors salient. So we know from a long, set of research studies and literature that metaphors play a very important role in learning, and almost automatically we bring in metaphors when we're trying to teach things to people, and oftentimes you see metaphors reflected in the gestures that people make when they're explaining things. Sometimes they'll do what are called representational gestures, where they'll actually try to create a visualization with their hand of something that they're talking about. And so we know that metaphors are very important, but they're often very ephemeral, right? So you say something that may be hard for somebody you describe something that might be hard for someone to picture in their mind, or you do something with your hands and then it's immediately gone because your hands are on to doing something else. And these kinds of environments, XR environments, allow those metaphors to be more salient, more recognizable, more things that can be reflected on. And so you can create these spaces where if you're trying to get somebody to understand a difficult concept through metaphors, you can make that metaphor visual and you can make it persistent and something that somebody can continue to interact with in a physical way. The other thing is that it allows for reflection. As I was saying, things are ephemeral. You do them in the real world and they sort of go away. But you can create whole structures and environments for really allowing people to dig in on these representations, these experiences in ways that you can't do in the real world. And then finally, something that I refer to as body cueing, that there's starting to be a pretty, I think, strong and persuasive literature showing that we already know that there's a close interaction between physical engagement and learning, but that often happens. We often study that as you do the learning first, and then you see that expressed through people's movements. So there's a lot of studies, for example, on people's spontaneous gestures as they're trying to understand some new concept. But there's also, I think, good reason to think about, well, can we actually start with the body movement first? Does it actually make more sense in some situations to get people to make representations with their body to convey something that they don't quite understand yet? But if you give them that sort of bodily experience first, and then allow them to sort of layer their knowledge and understanding of that idea on top of this physical representation that they've already created. And XR is great at this, right? You can encourage people to sort of make these physical representations. They might not know why initially, but they're making these representations, and then you use the digital environment within XR to sort of layer on that understanding and help them to make meaning. And I'll show you what I think is a pretty good example of this in one of my projects. So just to kind of wrap up this section of it, a key multiple perspectives has the potential to expand your thinking. And that's what you can, I think, really do effectively with XR. It can be an agent of learning by encouraging or cueing learners to move in ways that are believed to be conducive to certain ways of thinking or creating new metaphors. Okay, I'm gonna now switch over into talking about some specific examples that I've worked on over the years. I don't think I've seen any questions, but if any questions or clarifications come up, just interrupt me and let me know. So the first example that I want to give is actually a pretty old example, but I think it still holds up in terms of showing some really important truths about learning in XR space. So this was, about, we started this project almost like 15 or so years ago. And so at that time, we referred to this as mixed reality. And this was an environment where we were teaching students about how things move in space. So ideas of planetary astronomy and basic ideas of kinematics. And the environment that we created, it was actually intended to ultimately be a museum-like experience. And we did some tests on this in a couple different museums in Florida. And the environment largely consisted of a floor-based projection system where we could basically run a simulation on the floor, and then you get another display on the wall that was giving sort of information about how it is that people were moving. And you can kind of see this in the diagram here, where you've got this kid moving on this platform, and they've got these different things that they're doing, and then up on the wall is a 2D visualization of sort of tracking their movements and giving them another perspective on the thing that they're learning. And so, this will just be a quick example, kind of showing what this looks like. So this student is tasked with trying to launch an asteroid. So once they launch it from this sort of spring mechanism here, the asteroid will sort of behave according to the normative laws of physics and move in ways. And so they're trying to hit this red target here at the end, but you may notice that there's this big planet here that is going to have some effects on any objects that are moving by. But this student doesn't understand those mechanics, at least initially, and so we're going to sort of watch them kind of figure these things out as they go through successive images. So in the interest of time, I'm not going to show the whole video, but I will tell you that eventually he does hit the target. He's able to sort of figure out what the trajectory is and what effect the planet is having on that gravitational force. But the key thing is that he's interacting with it from a first person perspective, right? So it's not just like somebody watching, looking at an instructor doing diagrams on a board. They're getting that sort of first person view and trying to essentially be the asteroid and move the way that the asteroid is moving. And what we sort of hypothesized was that they were gaining some intuitions about that movement based on that experience that they could then translate to some learning assessment. And this is the results of a pretty large study that we did that compared students using that body-based version of that simulation versus just doing it on a desktop computer using a mouse to do those kinds of trials. And what you'll see here is that the whole body group does quite a bit significantly better on a number of different knowledge questions, also things like enjoying using the simulation and the belief that it helped with their learning. And the reason why I wanted to highlight this study is that it's still one of the I think cleaner comparisons between sort of like I don't like the term not embodied, because I kind of don't think that anything is not embodied, since we are humans with bodies, but sort of less embodied or limited embodied interaction as it is with the desktop computer. So you see that there's there's some advantage here doing the same activity from a more embodied perspective compared to the non-embodied perspective. Okay, so the second more recent example is this project called GRASP, where we were trying to use mixed reality XR technologies to support not just sort of learning of factual knowledge, kind of the way that it was in the previous example, but supporting the ability to create effective explanations, right? Which is kind of a more sophisticated kind of understanding. It's one thing to get somebody to sort of remember a number of concepts and facts, but to get them to be able to articulate that in a coherent way is a challenging thing for students, particularly the middle school students we were working with in this study to do. But I'll show you, this is what these GRASS simulations look like. So essentially you've got these 2D simulations that are encouraging students to put their hands into them. They initially start by showing these hands, and then as the students get acclimated to what their hands represent within those simulations, the hands disappear, and then they're just controlling the simulation with the movement of their hands because they understand at that point what their hands are representing. And so they're able to essentially be part of this simulation, and it's through that being part of the simulation and getting these prompts from the simulation itself that they're able to ultimately do a better job of articulating an explanation of things like what is gas pressure, what is heat transfer, and the causes of the seasons, which is what this student is doing in this example there. So again, in the interest of time, I think I'm going to not go through this whole transcript here. But this was an example of a student that we did sort of, we developed the simulation. We had them go through this experience of using it. And it was another good example, I think, of them coming to a better understanding because they were asking questions about what their hands represented within the XR space, right? And so XR creates this wonderful kind of environment where you are sort of forced to question, like, what is the meaning of these movements? What are these meanings of these things that I'm manipulating? You reflect on that meaning, and you often come to a sort of a better understanding of the phenomenon that's being simulated. And that's what we saw here with Dentrell.
How did you?
So the last thing, just on this project, to the point on assessment, is that we've done a number of studies where we've not just done like typically you'll do like a pre-test and then you'll do a post-test. This was actually an example where we felt like there were actually multiple points within the use of the simulation and talking to the researcher and doing activities where you could sort of measure their sort of evolving understanding. And I think that that's a really important thing to do within the XR space, that you're not just being like, oh, we're going to, figure out what they can do on a paper-based test before using XR and then look at what they can do on a paper-based test after using XR. There's a lot that happens, I think, in between that's important to capture. So using XR, using the platform itself for data collection, using more sort of periodic measures of what students know and understanding knowledge development as a more continuous thing, I think is a really important thing if we want to show the value and the power of XR technologies for learning and education. All right, my last example here is a project called CSER, Connections of Earth and Sky with Augmented Reality. And this was a project where the question was, well, we've now got these great augmented reality technologies. This was a few years back. The Microsoft Hololens had just come out. Obviously, that's not the AR headset of choice these days, but it was at the time. And the question was, well, but how are we going to use these technologies effectively in learning contexts? And as I said before, like I'm really opposed to this idea that we should be locking students into these single user immersive experiences. And so our question was, well, how can you actually use these immersive augmented reality experiences to create more effective collaborative spaces, right? So more spaces where you can have people working together with sort of a shared representational experience and talk about, these learning issues and solving real problems. And so this was actually an environment, and if I can, I guess I'd like to see if I can show a quick video here, at least the first part of it. Let me see if I can pull it up. The Caesar project is connections of Earth and sky with augmented reality. So augmented reality is this type of technology where you blend digital stuff with real world things. Those kinds of technologies present lots of really rich and exciting opportunities for education, where people can see real world things, but have that augmented through additional information or guides to help them understand what is important about that environment.
Caesar allows users to explore multiple perspectives of a simulated sky environment. The Caesar environment is unique in that it's accessible across augmented reality and more traditional two-dimensional technology interfaces. And the focus is on facilitating collaboration and information sharing.
Collaboration is important because in the 21st century, workforce requires you to learn collaboration because people will be working in collaborative environments where people are from different backgrounds and they bring different knowledge and they have to work in teams to solve problems.
I think the critical thing, what we need to think of integrating these technologies into the learning environments is we need to understand what each technology's capacity of what they can actually do. I think that.
So I'll stop that there. I'll pull my slides back up here. Moving down here. So the what the Caesar interface did is as you saw in the video, is it created this augmented perspective, this first-person perspective-based experience on the stars, such that you could actually see the map of the stars projected in the room. And what we did is we paired students who were in the AR, or we put an AR headset in groups of students that were trying to solve this problem of where are they located on Earth, just based on a view of the stars. And so we could give them this view both on tablet computers as well as in the headsets, but only one student had access to the headset at a time. And what we found is that the students were actually pretty good, and you saw some of this in the video, of using gesture to communicate their perspective to even students who are not using the AR headset. And what it essentially did was it created this this shared representational space. So you can see the student wearing the headset here is gesturing, and the other students are looking at their gestures and sort of understanding the point that they're making, even though they can't see the representation from the first person perspective on their own. And so we've done some analysis of this and found that, particularly for the groups of students who were doing this sort of cross-device communication, that it was much more effective for helping them to understand these complex problems as a group, and that they work better as a group and were able to solve this longitude and latitude determination question much more effectively. Okay, I'm just going to wrap up now with showing you real quickly this framework that I've worked on. So I have a collaborator, David DeLima at the University of Minnesota, and he and I, because of our sort of shared experiences working in this space with different XR projects in education, kind of laid out, well, what are the design considerations? What are the things that when you're actually trying to create one of these XR experiences, what are the things that we should be considering particularly from the student perspective and the kinds of interactions that they'll have. And so in this framework, we focused in on three things. We focused in on viewpoint, like what is it that the student using the XR is able to see? What kind of perspective are they visual perspective are they given? There's embodiment, what it is that that the student is able to interact with and what it is that they're able to control. What work is the embodiment actually doing? And then finally, what role? What is are they a student? Are they an expert? Are they some participant, some non-human participant in this simulated experience within XR? What is the role that they're playing? And we sort of talked about each of these components and how the different choices that you make as an XR designer can ultimately then influence what and how much students are able to learn from those experiences. So I'll stop there. I'll see if people have any questions. And yeah, really looking forward to hearing your ideas and thoughts about this work. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. That's really wonderful talk and lots of insights. I want to start with a question, but before the question, I first want to talk about my thoughts. I especially like the Earth and Sky, the SR project you showed at the end. I was a K-12 STEM teacher before my PhD, and I even personally proposed a similar SR universe SR game. But your project makes me feel, wow, it's pretty well, yeah, one, and maybe you can add more languages in future.
Yeah, for sure. You know, I'm not at all an expert in sort of language learning spaces, but I have many students come to me with those interests and have a lot of, I think, really interesting ideas of how XR can be used in that space. And I think particularly the component of perspective taking and sort of understanding like how perspective and sort of like what you can see, what your reference points are so important to your construction of language. And you know, there's obviously been a lot of work done on just what immersion means generally for learning. And so XR is an opportunity to create, I think, more creative and more reflective immersive spaces that could be designed, I think, more effectively to support language learning. But yeah, so I don't know that any of my projects speak directly to that, but I share your enthusiasm and it sounds like really good work that you've been doing in that space.
Okay, thank you. I will give the chance to the other audience. Any questions in the room or in chat? If not, first, actually, I have another question. I just don't want to. Oh,
Okay.
We have another question. Okay, good.
Thank you for the talk. Really, really useful and very useful in lots of ways to think about my own project and how it can work and teach. I had a question, I guess, clarification in educational theory between learning and retention. You talked about the differences between people doing it on screens and people doing it in AR, VR. I wonder if people have done longitudinal studies 6 months after the same students, do they still remember, do they retain that knowledge over time the same way or at the same levels? Because my hypothesis or suspicion would be people who kind of learn by doing would anchor that knowledge in a more permanent way. So can you talk about whether retention is part of your studies or that people are studying that within VR learning experiences?
Yeah, I mean, I think the unfortunate answer is that I think there's not nearly enough work on that question. And I think that's mostly for sort of practical reasons, right? Like I think that most people who sort of get in the space, maybe you get a grant or something to develop some sort of XR experience. Well, you know, it's often done for, you know, a short the things that you saw even in my talk were generally 20, 30-minute kinds of experiences. And so it's a little bit hard and probably too much to expect that those are going to lead to months long effects in terms of learning and understanding, that it would really need to be something more sustained. It's always been our intent, like with the Caesar project, for example, we've proposed and will continue to propose until it gets funded, taking the Caesar experience and turning it into not just like a one-day sort of thing, but actually used across a semester, and integrating these XR technologies into a longer term experience, such that you could, I think, find those more long term effects and do comparisons with more traditional ways of teaching those things over a longer period of time. That said, I think your intuitions about your hypothesis about likely leading to longer retention, leader to longer learning as a result of having these physical experiences, I believe is also true. We just need, I think, better ways of measuring. So like in the first study that I did, I mean, because that was kind of the only way that you showed learning at the time, was to do that sort of pre and post test. We were able to show it, but there were also a lot of other experiences that I think have been less successful at sort of showing that result. I don't necessarily think that means that they weren't learning more or learning something more, but it could perhaps be something different. It could be that they were sort of laying their learning and understanding into their physical senses. And if you're an embodied learning theorist like I am, you believe that that's kind of where your learning exists. So I think sometimes it's a matter of finding more creative ways of assessing our learning. And if we do that, I think we are likely to find more of those longer term effects from these kinds of interventions. But I think we need to continue to evolve it. I will say real quickly, I did do a study that was looking at learning transfer and whether or not having a XR experience prior to a XR experience in another domain. So these were two different domains of science. One was focused on earthquakes, one was focused on acids and bases. If you gave students experience with sort of the higher level concept, which was exponential growth, in XR in the first experience, and then versus like giving them exposure to that same concept outside of XR, and then gave them another XR experience that was sort of in that sort of transfer task. And that was 3 weeks later. So that was a pretty considerable amount of time to sort of take that learning across into a new domain. And that was a really exciting study. I can give the citation for that. We published that in Journal of EdPsych a couple of years ago.
Hi, Rob. This is Jen.
Oh, yep. Go ahead.
I hope I'm not interrupting with someone online. All right. Okay. I can go first. So, really like your talk, and there's so many interesting questions to like follow up. And the one on top of my head is that, I mean, you are a guru in learning theories, and especially in embodied learning. And I'm curious, what would you like to put on the top of your wish list from a education researcher perspective, that you want the XR technology, like the future XR technology, to be able to offer?
Yeah, great question, and it's so good to see you. So the two things that come to mind immediately, and this is of course related to current or projects that I'm sort of thinking about doing in the future. But I building on the Caesar project, like I still think we have a long way to go in terms of using XR to effectively support collaborative learning. And I know you agree with this, and you've done work in that space too, right? I mean, I think we have to to figure out, and it's possible that AI might be able to help us in this space, though I don't necessarily think that AI sort of solves all those problems. But sort of being aware not just of sort of like what people are saying in like a text chat, but also being aware of how people are moving and being able to give cues in that XR environment to support collaborative interactions that are more than just just like sort of a dumb chatbot saying like, did you think about this? Or maybe you want to ask a question now, or things like that. Like, I think we can do a whole lot better. And so I'm really excited to work with computer scientists and people who, have ideas for how to support that, HCI researchers, because I think that there's a lot of shared common ground in HCI and collaborative learning research that we can work on together. The other thing is haptics. So I've got a new project right now where we're actually trying to use haptics combined with these like visually immersive experiences that complement each other in meaningful ways. I think the feeling of touch and getting touch-based feedback when you're learning something is incredibly powerful, but we're traditionally not particularly good at sort of using that, particularly, especially within like ed tech kinds of spaces. So we need to figure out how do we sort of manage what kinds of information do we want to deliver through a haptic channel that can complement what it is that a learner is hearing and what it is that they're seeing. And I'm really, really excited about the possibility space there, because I think we've only scratched the surface in terms of what we can do with haptics.
Yeah.
Can I jump a quick follow-up? You had mentioned V-archaeology, which I've not personally experienced, but I'm a field archaeologist. And
Cool.
do they use haptics in the V-archaeology? Because field work is so physical, and you get feedback through your trowel as you dig, that I can't imagine it being a good simulation without haptics.
Yeah, I'm not sure that it does. I mean, and if it does, it's probably sort of the rudimentary, sort of like what comes with the commercial VR headsets, the sort of vibrations kinds of things. Like, it's certainly not giving you that sort of like tactile experience, sort of feeling what dirt feels like in a particular context. But I think that honestly, I think that potential is there. I know a number of sort of haptics folks here at the university and other spaces, and like some of the things that they were able to demo. We've got one a postdoc who actually worked on simulating the touch of like a human hand on like the face, right? Like, getting so good with what we're able to simulate. There's no reason why we can't start creating those kinds of experiences. But in terms of actually doing it and specifying like what are the important things that a person in a archaeological field site needs to feel in order to understand this conceptual thing that you as an expert archaeologist would want a student to understand. Like, there's a lot of work that needs to happen there too. I should put, if you're working in that space, I should put you in contact with Laura Shackelford if you don't know her already. She's the anthropologist, or she's an anthropologist, but she does this archaeological simulation experience, and she's very excited about this as a educational space. So yeah, please reach out and drop me an email after the talk. Other questions?
Yeah. So there's some comments at the chat.
Yeah.
It's just a reaction to the retention, the muscle memory. Actually, I have another question. So I really appreciate how you emphasize the importance of the affordances, aligning the SR affordances with the learning goals. So how do you see the potential for SR application, especially in K-12, maybe even younger age at K6? So for this age group, what kind of affordances do you think are most appropriate to consider?
Yeah, so I think in some ways, I mean, it's a bit paradoxical, right? Because the commercial guidelines for using these tools are to generally not try to use it for like really younger kids because of simulation sickness and things like that. But in a lot of ways, they're kind of the perfect target for it, right? And the reason I say that is because at that level and the kinds of learning that you're trying to engage them with, there's still a pretty close coupling, I think, in a lot of cases with what it is that you want students to learn and the kinds of physical interactions that you can simulate in XR. So if you're thinking about math, for example, and you're trying to get students to understand ideas of ratio or fractions or even just like sort of numeracy, it's pretty, I find it at least a lot easier to sort of say like, well, what are the kinds of physical experiences that directly sort of map to those kinds of understandings? And then I can simulate those experiences in XR, and I can create all sorts of scaffolding around those experiences that creates a sort of a nice sort of, I think, learning trajectory for those students. But you start to get to places like I'm actually doing a project right now on statistics learning, or you could think of this in, calculus or, these much more sort of abstract spaces. It's not that those domains don't have, physical correlates to them. They very much do. I mean, everything, comes from the fact that we live in this, three-dimensional space, and we have these kinds of three-dimensional interactions, right? So there's always, I think, a way to sort of get back to that. But it's a much longer sort of, trajectory to sort of explain, very theoretical things like limits and quantum mechanics and things like that, with simple physical metaphors. And so I think I find the younger students as being, a really good sort of test bed for that. And then, others need to be sort of working, well, how can we sort of layer those simple experiences, those clearer learning objectives with more complicated things as people progress through the grades in school.
Okay, thank you. If no more questions, thank you, Dr. Lindgren, and thank you all for attending. If you would like to continue following Robb's work, his contact info is in the chat. Please check out the rest of the Voices of XR speaker series and also recordings of the previous talks on the StudioX website. The links are also in the chat. Thank you all for joining and attending. Thank you for the wonderful talk, Dr. Lindgren. We all get like wonderful experience for that. Thanks. Thank you all. Okay,
Thank you
bye.
all. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Rob.